Chris Hensley is a registered representative of Cambridge Investment Research, Inc., a broker-dealer member of FINRA SIPC, investment advisor representative of Cambridge Investment Research Advisors, Inc., a registered investment advisor. Cambridge and Houston First Financial Group are not affiliated.
The Houston Midtown chapter of the Society for Financial Awareness presents Money Matters with your host, Christopher Hensley.
Good morning, everybody. You're listening to Money Matters on KPFT Houston. I'm Chris Hensley. The time is now 11 a.m. Got a great show lined up for you today. Business ownership is the second highest driver of household wealth in the U.S. behind home ownership today. We've all heard this term, silver tsunami, or the impending retirement of many business-owning baby boomers, which will result in the closure of businesses, loss of jobs, and the loss of critical local services. So where might worker co-ops play a role in this? Our guest today will be joining us very, very shortly. Melissa Hoover. She is the Executive Director of Democracy at Work Institute. So please stay tuned. Keep listening. But as you know, if you are a longtime listener, we always reserve just the first few minutes of the show to tell you a little bit about what's going on in the Houston and the Gulf Coast area when it comes to financial literacy. So I did have a teacher retirement system talk on Wednesday night. This was for any employees. Mostly it was University of Texas Healthcare Science Center, MD Anderson, Houston Community College, University of Houston, and the one thing that they all had in common is that many of them participated in the state pension or teacher retirement system. So we talked a lot about about the pension that they're involved with, and how when you do have a state pension or city pension or federal, local, city, state government pension, it may play an offset when it comes to your Social Security by two provisions, the windfall elimination provision and the government pension offset. So that is something that not everybody is aware of, and that's one of the topics that I go out and talk about is Social Security and the interplay with pensions. So we should be having some more of those talks coming out. I think the next one I'm going to be doing is Social Security coordination for couples. One of the things we're going to focus on is not just how to maximize your retirement benefit, which I think a lot of people, when we talk about Social Security, only think about the retirement benefit, but we forget that Social Security is also a survivor benefit. So our loved ones or spouses that are left behind, how do you coordinate it? If you're at different ages and different income earners over your lifetime, what is the best way to coordinate that? So that is something that will be coming up next month in October. So keep your ears open for that. And we always mention Houston Money Week as well, which Houston Money Week 2020. I know we're here in 2019 in October, but we're talking about Houston Money Week 2020 already. Because we've already started meeting. We have all of our nonprofits, our for-profits, the banks that are doing Community Reinvestment Act or CRA credits, local city governments, the local universities, the middle schools, the elementary schools. Many, many partners are involved in Houston Money Week, which takes place each and every year in the month of April. It used to be called, we call it Houston Money Week, but we have so many partners and events that take place that it actually goes almost across the entire month. And as you know, the website, HoustonMoneyWeek.org, is a dynamic website. Many of our partners aren't just doing free financial education workshops in the month of April. They're doing this year long. So you're always welcome to check the website out, Houston moneyweek.org, and see if there is a free workshop or seminar near you that you might be interested in. On the other hand, if you are wondering how you can become involved, we're always looking for partners, whether that means coming out to our meetings once a month that we have at the United Way off of Waugh here in Houston, or if you are an employer, program director, executive director at a nonprofit organization, anywhere where you have constituents or employees where you want a free workshop or seminar during Financial Literacy Month next year in 2020, let us know. We have speakers that are available to come out and do these talks. The one caveat is that it is not a sales event, so there's no cost. In fact, organizations that are involved cannot talk about products or solicit from these events, so it is a free. That is the one thing that we don't have a lot of rules, but that's one of the rules that we have. So with that, let's go ahead and get our guest on the air. Melissa, are you there? Melissa, are you there? Oh, hey.
Yes, hello, good morning. Hi.
Good morning. How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing great. So I usually start the show the same way. I'll usually introduce the audience to you by sharing your bio. So let me go ahead and do that now. Melissa Hoover is the founding executive director of the Democracy at Work Institute, the think and do tank that expands worker cooperatives as a strategy to address economic and racial inequality. A leader in the worker ownership movement for over 15 years, Melissa helped start and grow the United States Federation of Worker Co-ops or Cooperatives, the national grassroots membership organization for worker-owned businesses. She has a cooperative business development for many years with the, now let me make sure I'm pronouncing this, Arizmendi?
Yes, good enough. Arizmendi.
Okay. I tried there. Association of Cooperatives in Oakland, doing business and capital planning for 2 startups, training cooperative members, and serving as CFO in the first year of each startup's operations. Whew. Okay, Melissa, thank you for joining us today.
Yes, thank you for having me.
What can you tell us about yourself outside of the bio that will help our listeners get to know you a little bit more?
Well, I think the main thing to know is that I'm sort of an accidental entrepreneur. I didn't study business in college. I hadn't intended to own or start businesses. But I really came to cooperative business ownership out of looking at who was locked out of owning businesses and having a natural inclination myself, I think, to cooperate and work together with others. I just found some of the most exciting work that was available to me as a young person in my career in businesses that were cooperatively owned and in organizations that were helping them get started. And for me, the challenge of figuring out how to structure shared ownership and how to work together and how to run a business, I just found that I took to it and fell in love with it, fell in love with both small business entrepreneurship and cooperatives.
I love that. I wrote that term down, accidental entrepreneur. I would consider myself one of those as a philosophy and English major who ended up in finance. I would say right. I'm an accidental entrepreneur as well, but I love it. And I love entrepreneurs, and I love that passion that people have with their businesses. And I like this idea, the idea of the co-op. Tell us a little bit, what's the connection between entrepreneurship and community wealth?
Well, so I actually think a lot of us are accidental entrepreneurs, right? You start a business because you like to do the thing that you do, and then you realize you can make money at it, or you start a business with your friends and family and business partners because you all work together well. So I think there's a way that we have this idea around entrepreneurship, like it's some, specialized, really difficult, inaccessible thing. But my view is that most of us have some seed of entrepreneurship in us, and that there are ways to help that seed kind of root and blossom. And so, I guess I would start by saying I think entrepreneurship is much more broad-based than we give it credit for. There are entrepreneurs everywhere. And then for me, the relationship between entrepreneurship and community wealth is that entrepreneurship builds wealth. As you mentioned at the beginning, businesses are the second largest asset class. So that's how folks are building wealth. When you share business, when you have broad-based business ownership, then you're building wealth beyond just the business owner, the single business owner. You're building wealth among multiple business owners. And so we think of community wealth really as that's one pillar of community wealth, right? The more people who can own part of a community's assets, the more wealth will be spread around. And then I think more broadly, this idea of community wealth is that there's a wealth of skills and talents in our communities that people can use more deeply when they own a business together. But also there's a sort of set of values that says the community should benefit from what's going on in it, right? From the business relationships, from the financial transactions, from what's being produced or the services that are being offered. So the more we can think about who benefits from these businesses and does the community benefit, then the closer we are to tying entrepreneurship to community wealth.
I love that. For listeners who don't realize the difference, what's the difference between a worker co-op and most small businesses on, say, Main Street?
So, I would say 80% of their DNA is the same. They're very similar. They're trying to provide a service or make a product. They have a customer base. They've got costs. They're innovating. All of that stuff is true. They face the same kind of real estate, tax pressures, all of that. I think the real difference between most small businesses and worker cooperatives does come down to that question of benefit. So the cooperative form is really designed around a set of values and principles that says that the people who own the business, the people who work in it, should benefit from it. And then there's a sort of secondary principle that the community should also benefit from the business. So, I think most small businesses sort of have that without stating it, right? That the owner of the business wants to benefit from it. The difference is when the business has several owners, right? When all 10 people who work in it own it, it's designed for their benefit structurally. So they each own a share, and they each get a share of the profits based on that share ownership. And then they share in the decision-making for the business. And I think there may be a misconception about cooperatives or shared ownership of business, that it's like everybody's sitting around making decisions about everything all the time together. And that's really not true. You organize the operations of the business just like the operations of any business. You have to sort of follow the mandates of whatever it is you're producing or the service you're creating. But at the governance level, where the strategic decisions are made, the larger decisions, the financial decisions, that's where all of the owners come together and say, we're going to decide this together because it affects all of us.
So I love that because you mentioned I think sole proprietors and just business owners at the beginning that it's kind of implicit that they're going to benefit from it, but when it's a larger organization with more people, getting the community to also benefit, or having several owners. And you mentioned one of the kind of myths or things that's out there that there are too many cooks in the kitchen or spoil it. but right. The idea that everybody making decisions about everything. But you mentioned that depending on the business model and what's actually going on, the most important things, the governance decisions are what is shared, and I guess each business model is going to be different as to what pieces those are. I love this. Tell me a little bit more about the organization that you are part of, Democracy at Work. What does Democracy at Work Institute do?
So we call ourselves a think and do tank because we're practical people, and we thought our field needed not just another think tank, but also a sort of hands-on organization that really understands how the form works on the ground, because it's still relatively new to a lot of folks, and so some of people's first questions are just functional and structural. How does it work? So we do research on the state of the field, and I will take the opportunity to mention here that our research shows, and the research of our partners shows, that one of the differences of cooperative businesses from small businesses is that they tend to be stabler, longer lasting, higher productivity, better retention of workers. So when a cooperative business is successful, it tends to be really successful and in it for the long haul. So our research measures the state of the sector. We do an annual survey and a census of individual owners, and just sort of trying to gather basic data so we can make the case that worker cooperatives are successful and are having impact. But in addition to that, we do training and education, outreach to business owners, some of that hands-on kind of preparation and support for people who are starting or converting their business to a cooperative. And then I would say the third thing we do is kind of this larger level of building partnerships with cities and financial institutions, federal government, private sector players, to be able to say, you know, worker co-ops sit alongside other small businesses. We're right there with you. We are part of what the larger small business community needs, right, in terms of supports, but we're also right next to organizations that are trying to improve conditions for low-wage workers, for immigrants, for people of color, for communities, low-income communities. So we try to build those partnerships to show and to demonstrate and to be with the sort of be enmeshed in the larger work. For too long, I think cooperatives have sat off to the side, like, oh, that's just a sort of special, exotic thing that doesn't really fit anywhere. And our point is we want to say we fit everywhere. We fit with small business, but we also fit with justice and values-driven organizations.
So I love that, because you're right. When people think of business structures, you think partnership, sole proprietor, co-op doesn't necessarily bump to the first place in your mind.
Yeah.
But one of the things that you just mentioned is, the employees being happier. There's better retention. There are some arguments to be made that this is a good way to be inclusive as well. You talked about immigrants and people of color being part of that. And so for those reasons, I really, really like the idea. Now, I'm going to be honest. When I think of co-ops that here in Texas, I'm trying to think of, well, where have I seen that? And the ones that pop into my head are restaurants in Austin, and this is not scientific. It did seem like the employees were happy there because of the business structure. However, that's just my own narrow perception there. Where are worker cooperatives popular and successful in the U.S.? Can you share some examples with us?
Sure, yeah. I can do it by geography, but then I think also it might be more interesting to do it by sector, because as you mentioned, there are a lot of cooperatives focused in the food sector, whether that's restaurants or grocery stores or even value-added processing or food production. It's just sort of part of the cooperative DNA here in the U.S. We have our rural agricultural co-ops, and there's a strong historical connection to food production and cooperatives. So it makes sense to me that they would concentrate in food, but increasingly we are seeing worker cooperatives in the service sector, in child care, in home care. The largest worker co-op in the U.S., which is about 2,000 employees, roughly half of whom are owners of the co-op, is based in New York City, and it's a home care cooperative. So they serve New York City's seniors, people with mobility issues. They go into the home and provide care. And one of the arguments there for the growth of co-ops in the care sector has been, if you own the job, you're going to do a better job caring. If you care about the job, you will care more and better in your job. And I think that's really compelling. We have seen over the last 10 years or so, we know that home care as a sector is really exploding because we have an aging population, but we have seen a real growth within the care economy. In fact, I think in Texas, there is a cooperative home care agency called Equality, and I'm not exactly sure where they're based, but that's on my radar. And we can see home care co-ops sort of across the country, particularly in rural areas where there's a need. And in general, that's where you'll start finding cooperative growth, is where there's a market gap that's not being filled by conventional businesses. So in rural areas, in the care economy, with early stage entrepreneurs who come together to pool their capital and start their business. This is very common in immigrant communities, particularly with people who are locked out of other kinds of jobs. And then most recently, we've seen a growth of worker cooperatives as a strategy for small business owners who are trying to retire and who can't find anybody to buy their business.
That's unique. I haven't thought about that. So, because that's a big, in my industry, having a transition plan of what happens if either you pass away or you're ready to exit the business is a thing. And this is something that hasn't really come on our radar yet, but maybe it should. I'm making a big note here. Some of the things you just mentioned right now is, the first thing that popped in my head were the restaurants, but you mentioned the service sector. You mentioned child care. You talked about home health care, home care.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned New York as having one of the bigger ones. And I like that when we were talking earlier about that silver tsunami, the retirees, the baby boomers. That is a big area that is just growing. The idea that people take pride in ownership, that maybe if they own the business, that there's the idea that they will do better, and be more passionate about it and put their heart into it. Let's talk about why are cities betting on shared ownership of businesses to strengthen their local economies?
Well, so cities are really feeling the silver tsunami. They're feeling it too. They're looking for creative solutions to support and retain their small business base, whether that's on a main street or in manufacturing or in the care economy. We know that, upwards of 15% of business owners don't have a succession plan, or they haven't communicated it if they do. Only about 15% of businesses will transfer to children. People say, oh, well, the kids will take it over. Increasingly, that's not true. And then about 1 in 5 businesses that were for sale last year sold. So that means 4 out of 5 businesses have not found a buyer. So really, in so many cases, we're looking at business owners who don't have many options. Or if they do have options, they're not great options from a city perspective. So we're starting to see private equity get interested in buying small businesses. But oftentimes what they're going to do is buy the business, roll it up with a bunch of other businesses into a national kind of consolidation, or sell it off for parts. And that's heartbreaking for a small business owner, and it can be devastating for a local economy, for so many businesses to close, all the jobs that they provide, or the sort of economic drivers. So we're seeing city governments across the country going, well, what do we do? How do we intervene in this market of all of these businesses for sale and so few of them actually getting bought, and even fewer of them staying local once they are bought. So we've seen New York, San Francisco, Boston, some of the coastal cities that have higher pressures, right, higher growth pressures, but then also places like Madison, Wisconsin, that want to root their small business community, look at, okay, how can we make this option available to small business owners? How can we use our city policy incentives and do some funding to increase awareness and capital access? Because, in order to sell your business to your employees, somebody generally has to finance that, and it can't always be the owner of the business. You want someone from outside. So I think cities are betting on shared ownership because they see it as a strategy to retain their base of small businesses.
So I love that. So you talked about a lot of things. Let me unpack some of that here. If you're just joining us, we're talking with Melissa Hoover. She is the Executive Director of Democracy at Work Institute. We will, at the end of the show, we're going to give you contact information to get in touch with with her, and also on the podcast notes. So if you're driving, don't feel like you have to stop right now. We will give that information again. The website is www.institute.coop, and then you mentioned to me off the air that there's a website called becomingemployeeowned.org as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, so if we have any small business owners listening, or organizations that work with small business owners, becomingemployeeowned.org might be of interest to you, because it tells the stories of dozens of small business owners that have sold to their employees, and it tells those stories both from the side of the owner and from the side of the employees who became the owners. So you can really see it. One of the things I think that's helpful is for folks to just see that this has been done successfully, and those businesses have not only stayed running, but in many cases have grown and thrived.
Absolutely. And so what we were just talking about, to me, seems really important, because when we talk about succession planning for businesses, I'm an entrepreneur, and I can tell you that If you've listened to the show in the past, you've heard me talk about small business owners and entrepreneurs seeing their business as almost like a second child. They put their heart into it, and just because you want to give it to a family member, it doesn't mean that family member is interested or is going to raise their hand and say they want to do that. And why would you make them do something they don't want to do? When it comes time to transition out of the business, like you mentioned, I think 1 in 5 businesses that go on the market are actually sell, and the other ones are still looking for buyers. The idea that private equity is coming in. I mean, how many times have we seen that when mergers and acquisitions take over? They'll tell you anything. They come in and they strip the businesses down, sell off the assets, and that's not really what you want to see happen to something you put blood and sweat into.
That's right.
And so the idea of having this shared ownership as a possibility for the owner either to exit or hand it over to the employees, whether it's funded by the sale by the owner, maybe he's doing a loan to them, or you've got a company coming in and doing the lending on it, and that's where you get in the capital needs part of it. Very, very interesting way to look at that. Let's talk about, and we've only got just about 5 more minutes before the end of the show here. If Houston business owners or aspiring entrepreneurs are interested in worker co-ops, where should they start?
Sure. Yeah. So for business owners, I would say, it's not a fit for everybody. So we're not trying to sell this across the board. We just want to make it available for companies that it does make sense for. So I think part of the first place an owner who's exploring this option or looking at retirement can start is just to sit down and look at the finances, look at the culture and capacity of your employees, read some of those case studies on BecomingEmployeeOwned.org, and you can even talk to an advisor with us through that site. So we've got a little calendar appointment maker. You can make an appointment to talk to one of the many organizations around the country that knows how to do these transitions, help you get evaluation, figure out how to finance it, whether it's a fit for you and for your business. So there is this, Becoming Employee Owned is really the portal. If you want to talk to the employee ownership community and those of us who know how to support cooperative transitions, but you can also talk to your own financial advisor. In a lot of cases, they're not going to be familiar with the option, and they might even discourage you from it, thinking it'll be harder or less possible to do. But I would encourage folks to talk to not only those of us in our sort of field who support this stuff, but also to your everyday folks, your financial advisor, your bank, the local small business development center, so that we can begin, introducing this concept to people and showing that there's a demand for it. And then in terms of starting a co-op, we offer resources for that. There are several partner organizations around the country that do as well. But at our website, institute.coop, if you're interested in starting a worker co-op, you can attend our Startup Roadmap webinar. It's like an hour-long, sort of walks you through the basics of cooperative ownership. We also have a library of case studies and documents. And then I think there is at least one, maybe more, cooperative development centers in Texas. So throughout the country, there are these state cooperative development centers that are funded in part by USDA to support folks in accessing information and help them figure out how to create cooperatives. So I'm afraid I think there's one in the Rio Grande Valley. I'm not sure if there's one near Houston. They tend to be in rural areas.
I love that. There's a lot of resources that you just mentioned that I didn't realize were out there, and I'm sure listeners didn't realize that were out there. What a great a place to find out about these resources if you're looking to do diligence and considering this. Thanks for listening to today's episode of Money Matters Podcast. If you enjoyed the show, visit us on the web at www.moneymatterspodcast.com. Drop us a line on SpeakPipe on the right-hand corner. It will receive any voicemails, questions, thoughts, concerns that you have about the show. In addition to this, we recently launched a Patreon campaign. Click on the Donate Now tab to hit the tip jar and find out what Patreon's campaign is all about.